A weathered barn with peeling paint, a man with calloused hands counting out $41 bills, and a horse that nobody wanted. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the incredible true story that shocked the prestigious Lexington auction house and turned the horse racing world upside down. $40 for that thing. You're wasting your money, Joe, the neighbors would say. But Joe Bradley knew something they didn't. The old farmer had spent his life working the same patch of land his grandfather had tilled, living modestly while the sprawling horse farms around him grew more opulent each year. His weathered pickup truck looked comically out of place when he pulled up to that auction house, a place usually reserved for millionaires in tailored suits and wealthy oil barons flying in on private jets. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The auction floor fell silent when Joe's horse entered the ring. The auctioneer's eyebrow raised slightly. This wasn't the caliber of animal typically showcased here. The wealthy buyers exchanged knowing glances, some even chuckling behind their catalogs. The horse, with its unusual gait and unremarkable lineage, seemed destined to be overlooked among the million-dollar thoroughbreds on display. Then something changed, a whisper from one trainer to another, a second glance from a veteran breeder. Something about the way this horse moved, something special that only the most experienced eye could catch. When the bidding started for the first race, nobody expected Joe's $40 investment to even qualify, let alone compete. The starting gates lined up like a perfect illustration of America's wealth gap. Horses worth hundreds of thousands, trained by the best in the business, that diets more carefully planned than most humans, standing alongside Joe's humble entry. The starting bell rang, the crowd roared, and Joe's horse, the one that costs less than a decent dinner for two, showed everyone what heart really means in this sport. "Impossible," shouted one commentator as the unthinkable unfolded before thousands of stunned spectators. Racing dynasties built over generations suddenly found themselves facing an unexpected challenger. The owners' boxes fell silent as the impossible became reality lap after breathtaking lap. But this story isn't just about a horse that could run fast. It's about a farmer who believed when no one else would. It's about looking beyond pedigree and price tags to see true potential. And most of all, it's about that moment when everything you think you know about what determines success gets turned on its head. As Joe's horse thundered toward the finish line, the wealthiest man at the auction house gripped his armrest, his face drained of color. His million-dollar thoroughbred, the sure thing, the can't-miss champion, was about to be defeated by a horse that costs less than the champagne being served in the VIP section. The crowd held its collective breath as Joe's horse, later nicknamed Fortune, crossed the finish line a full 2 lengths ahead of the million-dollar thoroughbred. For 3 heartbeats, the entire venue was silent. Then, chaos erupted. The auctioneer's gavel dropped so hard it cracked the wooden block beneath it. Phones were frantically dialed as reporters scrambled to capture what had just happened. And Joe? He stood there, weathered hat in hand, as stunned as everyone else. But this miracle didn't happen overnight. 6 months earlier, Joe had been facing foreclosure on the small farm his family had owned for 3 generations. His crops had failed 2 seasons running, and the bank was running out of patience. That's when he spotted Fortune, thin and neglected, tied to a post outside the local feed store with a cardboard sign. For sale, $40. The horse had clearly been mistreated. Ribs showing through a dull coat, eyes downcast, Fortune looked nothing like a champion. But something in those eyes caught Joe's attention, a spark, a fighting spirit that reminded him of himself. Joe had exactly $40 saved for seed for the next planting season. Without seeds, there would be no crop. Without a crop, there would be no farm. It was the definition of a foolish decision, but Joe handed over his last $40 anyway. "My wife thought I'd lost my mind," Joe would later tell reporters. Honestly, looking back, maybe I had. For months, Joe worked with Fortune every morning before dawn and every evening after finishing his odd jobs around town. He couldn't afford proper training equipment, so he improvised, using old tires for strength training and clearing a makeshift track around his property. The practice sessions became a local curiosity. Neighbors would stop their cars to watch the unlikely pair, the struggling farmer and his rescue horse, working with a determination that bordered on obsession. What no one knew was that Joe had found some old papers tucked into Fortune's worn halter the day he bought him. Faded and water-damaged, they hinted at a bloodline far more impressive than the horse's appearance suggested. Joe spent nights in the public library researching, tracing back Fortune's lineage to a champion that had mysteriously disappeared from the racing scene years earlier. The day of the auction wasn't actually supposed to include a race. It was when buyers could see the horses in action before bidding. But something unexpected happened during Fortune's demonstration run. The horse moved with such power and grace that Chester Wellington IA, the most influential figure in racing, stood up from his private box and demanded a proper race to test what he was seeing. Wellington had brought his prize horse, Golden Emperor, a $3.2 million investment with a perfect racing record. "Let's settle this now," Wellington had announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the confidence of a man unaccustomed to losing. "My Emperor against that farm horse." The way he said farm horse drew chuckles from the wealthy spectators. What Wellington didn't know was that Joe had been approached just minutes before by a mysterious woman who seemed to know an awful lot about Fortune's hidden past. "Don't let him intimidate you," she had whispered urgently to Joe. "That horse of yours has something they're all afraid of." Before Joe could ask what she meant, she pressed a worn leather pouch into his palm. "Give him this before the race. It belonged to his sire." When Joe opened it later in the stables, he found an unusual brass medallion engraved with symbols he didn't recognize. As Fortune lined up at the starting gate, the medallion secured beneath his saddle, Wellington leaned over the railing. "I'll buy that nag for $10,000 after my Emperor humiliates him," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Might make $1 million going once," the auctioneer began, his voice trembling with excitement. That's when the double doors at the back of the auction house swung open. A hush fell over the crowd as an elderly man in a worn suit walked slowly down the center aisle, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. Those nearest recognized him immediately: Harold Donovan, once the most celebrated horse breeder in Kentucky before a scandal 20 years ago had destroyed his reputation and fortune. "That horse," Harold said, his voice carrying despite its age-weathered rasp, "is not for sale at any price." He turned to Joe. "Son, do you have any idea what you got there?" Before Joe could answer, Wellington signaled to his security team. "This is a private auction, Mr. Donovan. You're not welcome here." "I have every right to be here," Harold replied, "when you're trying to buy stolen bloodlines." He turned to address the stunned crowd. "That horse is the direct descendant of Midnight Thunder, my prize stallion that disappeared 20 years ago. The one Wellington claimed died in the stable fire." The auction house erupted in chaos. Midnight Thunder had been insured for millions, and his disappearance had been racing's biggest scandal. Wellington had collected the insurance payout, while Donovan was ruined by accusations of fraud. As security moved toward Harold, the mysterious woman who had given Joe the medallion stepped forward. "I can confirm everything Mr. Donovan is saying," she announced. "I have DNA evidence." She opened a folder, revealing documents that caused several racing officials to crowd around her. Wellington's calm facade completely crumbled. "This is absurd. That farmer probably stole the horse himself. Check his background." Joe, overwhelmed by the accusations flying around him, found his voice. "I told you how I got him. For $40 outside the feed store." He looked around the room, seeing only wealthy people fighting over something they viewed as a commodity. "Fortune isn't just a money machine. He's a living thing that was abandoned and mistreated. I nursed him back to health because it was the right thing to do, not because I was hoping for a payday." The room fell silent at the simple dignity in Joe's words. Harold Donovan limped over to Fortune and gently stroked the horse's muzzle. "My Midnight's eyes," he whispered. "I'd know them anywhere." The horse snickered softly, leaning into the old man's touch. The mysterious woman approached Joe. "My name is Eliza Donovan. Harold is my grandfather. I've spent 5 years tracing Midnight Thunder's offspring through black market sales and hidden transfers. Your Fortune is the last direct descendant, and the only one Wellington hasn't managed to buy and quietly remove from racing." "Why would he do that?" Joe asked. "Because Midnight Thunder's line carries a genetic advantage, unusual stamina and heart size. Wellington's breeding program can't compete, so he's been eliminating the competition." She lowered her voice. "The medallion I gave you belonged to my grandmother. She always said it brought luck to the true-hearted." As this revelation spread through the auction house, Wellington made a desperate final play. He approached Joe directly, writing a figure on a slip of paper. $2 million right now, cash. Plus, you keep the breeding rights. Just publicly deny this ridiculous story." Joe stared at the number, enough to save his farm and secure his family's future for generations. He looked at Fortune, at Harold's hopeful face, and at Elisa's pleading eyes. Before Joe could respond, the auction house doors burst open again. A group of stern-faced men in suits entered, flashing badges. "Federal agents," their leader announced. "Nobody leaves this room. We're investigating charges of insurance fraud, animal cruelty, and racketeering in the racing industry. One agent approached Wellington directly. Sir, we have a warrant to search your breeding facilities and financial records. Wellington's face turned ashen. He reached inside his jacket, causing several agents to tense, but he merely pulled out a phone. After typing a quick message, he smiled coldly at Joe. You should have taken the money while you could. As if on cue, Joe's phone rang. He answered to hear his wife's panicked voice. Joe, there are men at the farm. They say they're here to repossess Fortune, that you don't have proper ownership papers. They're trying to load him into a trailer right now. The federal agent in charge overheard and immediately dispatched officers to Joe's farm, but Wellington's smile didn't waver. It'll be too late, he said quietly. And about the horse, you have no proof of anything. Joe looked desperately at Harold and Eliza. The old man's face had gone pale with fury and fear. Eliza was already on her phone, apparently calling reinforcements of her own. What happens now depends on who reaches your farm first, Wellington said, his voice barely above a whisper. My men, the federal agents, or something worse. The racing world has more dangerous players than you can imagine, farmer. And that horse threatens decades of carefully constructed bloodlines and billions in breeding rights. As Joe rushed for the door, one thought consumed him. How had his simple act of kindness, buying an unwanted horse for $40, unleashed a storm that now threatened everything he cared about? Joe sprinted through the auction house parking lot, heart hammering against his ribs. Eliza was right behind him, already on her phone coordinating with people Joe didn't know. We got friends about 20 minutes from your farm, she called out. Old-timers who loved my grandfather and hate Wellington. They'll do what they can to stall. My truck won't make it in time, Joe said, fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them. We'll take mine. Harold Donovan appeared beside them, tossing keys to Eliza. Despite his age and cane, a fierce determination had straightened his posture. Black Range Rover, E-Slot. I may have lost my fortune, but I kept one good vehicle. As they raced toward Joe's farm on country roads, Harold filled in the gaps of the story. 20 years ago, Wellington was just starting out in racing. My Midnight Thunder was unbeatable, and his offspring were becoming the gold standard in the industry. Wellington offered to buy him for a fortune. When I refused, there was a fire. The insurance investigators claimed it was my fault, Harold continued, his voice tight with old pain. They found evidence I'd supposedly planted. Wellington consoled me publicly while privately spreading rumors. Then he started buying up Midnight's offspring through shell companies. But one mare was pregnant when she was sold, Eliza added. The new owners didn't know. She gave birth to Fortune's mother, who eventually ended up at a failing breeding operation. When they went bankrupt, their horses scattered through auctions and private sales. Joe gripped the door handle as Eliza took a turn fast enough to lift 2 wheels off the ground. So Fortune isn't just any horse. He's the last pure descendant of a champion bloodline that Wellington has been systematically erasing. Exactly, Harold nodded. And based on today's performance, he's inherited every bit of Midnight's ability. They crested a hill and Joe's modest farmhouse came into view in the distance. Even from a quarter-mile away, they could see the chaos. 3 black SUVs parked haphazardly in the yard, men in dark clothing struggling with something near the barn, and Joe's wife Lucy standing her ground at the farmhouse door, shotgun raised. Lucy, Joe whispered, terror gripping his chest. Without slowing, Eliza grabbed a small 2-way radio. Team positions? She barked into it. A crackly voice responded. East Field and North Road covered. Ready on your signal. Joe looked at her in shock. Who exactly are you people? The Equine Heritage Protection Alliance, Harold explained grimly. After Wellington destroyed me, others in the industry started noticing their best bloodlines mysteriously underperforming or disappearing. We've been gathering evidence for years. As they skidded to a stop at the farm's entrance, the scene before them became clear. Wellington's men had Fortune halfway loaded into a trailer while others were ransacking the barn. Lucy was keeping them from entering the house, where Joe could see his kids' frightened faces at the window. Federal agents are 3 minutes out, Eliza said, checking her phone. We need to stall them. Joe didn't wait. He leaped from the vehicle and sprinted toward the barn, pure protective fury carrying him faster than he'd ever moved. One of Wellington's men spotted him and stepped forward to intercept, but in the distance came the sound of engines, several of them, roaring up the other farm roads. From 3 directions, pickup trucks and SUVs appeared, driven by weather-beaten men and women who looked like they'd spent their lives on horse farms. Wellington's men hesitated, suddenly outnumbered. "Get away from my horse," Joe shouted, closing the distance to the trailer. The leader of Wellington's team, a cold-eyed man in expensive boots, pulled out his phone. "Mr. Wellington says to inform you that he owns the bank note on your farm. As of 20 minutes ago, he's called in your loan. This entire property and everything on it is subject to immediate repossession." Joe felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The farm loan, he'd been struggling with payments for months. "That's illegal," Harold shouted, limping up behind Joe. "You can't transfer and call in a note without proper notification." The man smiled thinly. "Check the fine print of your loan agreement, farmer. There are acceleration clauses for suspected criminal activity, like stealing a valuable racehorse." "I didn't steal anything," Joe protested. "Your word against Mr. Wellington's considerable influence," the man replied smoothly. "Now step aside." Fortune whinnied in distress from the trailer, fighting against the restraints. The sound broke something open in Joe's heart. This wasn't just about money anymore, or even about his farm. This was about right and wrong, about a system where the powerful could simply take what they wanted. "I'm not moving," Joe said, planting his feet. Behind him, Harold and Eliza stood shoulder to shoulder with Lucy, who had advanced from the house. Around them, the members of the Equine Heritage Protection Alliance formed a human barrier. The standoff trembled on a knife's edge. In the distance, sirens wailed, the federal agents closing in. Wellington's man reached inside his jacket, and for one terrifying moment, Joe thought he was drawing a weapon. Instead, he produced a document, final offer, signed over the horse, with a legal NDA about everything you've heard today. And Mr. Wellington will not only cancel your debt, but pay you $5 million. $5 million. The number hit Joe like a physical force. It was freedom, security, a future for his children, beyond anything he'd imagined possible. "Don't do it," Harold whispered urgently. "Once you sign, they'll bury the evidence. Wellington walks away clean, and he'll still control racing for another generation." The sirens grew louder. Wellington's man extended the document and a pen. "Decide now. The moment those federal agents arrive, the offer disappears forever." Joe's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. $5 million against what? Some old breeder's revenge quest. The abstract concept of fairness in a sport he'd never been part of. But then Fortune gave another desperate whinny, struggling harder against his restraints. Joe looked into the horse's eyes and saw the same thing he'd noticed that first day outside the feed store, a fighting spirit that refused to quit. At that moment, a sleek black car roared up the driveway, sliding to a dramatic stop behind Wellington's vehicles. The back door opened, and Chester Wellington II himself emerged, looking furious. "Incompetent fools," he snarled at his men. "Give me that." He snatched the document and approached Joe directly. "Listen carefully, farmer. This is bigger than you understand. Sign the paper, take the money, and forget everything. That's not just an offer. It's the only way your family stays safe." The threat hung in the air between them as the first federal vehicles appeared on the horizon. Joe looked from Wellington to his wife, to his terrified children watching from the window, to Harold and Eliza standing defiantly behind him, to Fortune still fighting in the trailer. In that moment, with seconds left to decide, the full weight of the choice pressed down on him. Money and safety on one side, justice and principle on the other. Wellington thrust the pen forward one last time. "Final chance. What's it going to be?" Joe stared at the pen in Wellington's hand, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. The federal vehicles were less than 30 seconds away, dust clouds rising behind them. Time seemed to slow as Joe looked once more at his family, then at Fortune still struggling in the trailer. "No," Joe said finally, his voice finding strength with each word. "Some things aren't for sale." Wellington's face contorted with rage. "You fool." But his words were cut short as the federal agents swarmed onto the property, weapons drawn. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are." The lead agent, a stern-faced woman, approached quickly. "Chester Wellington, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of insurance fraud, witness intimidation, and racketeering." Wellington's cool facade crumbled completely. "This is absurd. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir, we do," the agent replied calmly. "We've been building this case for 3 years. Your text messages ordering the illegal seizure of this horse were the final evidence we needed." As Wellington was led away in handcuffs, protesting loudly, the agents began to secure the scene. Joe rushed to the trailer where Eliza was already working to free Fortune. The horse was trembling but unharmed, and he pressed his muzzle against Joe's chest the moment he was free. "I almost gave in," Joe admitted quietly to Harold, who had limped over to join them. $5 million. Harold placed a weathered hand on Joe's shoulder. But he didn't. That's what matters. In the weeks that followed, the full story emerged. Wellington's empire began to crumble as evidence of decades of fraud and corruption came to light. The Racing Commission launched a full investigation, with Harold Donovan testifying as their star witness. Fortune's DNA confirmed what they already knew. He was indeed the direct descendant of Midnight Thunder. Joe's farm was safe. The fraudulent loan transfer was reversed, and the publicity from the case wrought unexpected support. Local farmers showed up to help with repairs, and racing enthusiasts made pilgrimages just to catch a glimpse of Fortune, the $40 horse that had exposed corruption in the racing world. On a crisp fall morning 6 months later, Joe stood at the rail of a different racetrack. Fortune was preparing for his first official race, with top trainers having volunteered their services pro bono. The story of the poor farmer and his miracle horse had captured hearts across the country. Nervous, Elise asked, joining him at the rail. She had become a friend and advisor, helping Joe navigate the unfamiliar world of professional racing. Terrified, Joe admitted with a laugh, "But not about the race." He nodded toward the stands where Lucy sat with their children, alongside Harold Donovan. The old breeder was smiling more these days, his reputation restored and his life's work vindicated. "I'm terrified that all this," Joe gestured to the crowds, the cameras, the attention, "might change what matters. I don't want to become what we fought against." Elisa smiled. "That's why you won't." The starting bell rang and Fortune ran like his legendary grandfather, not for fame or fortune, but for the pure joy of running. As he crossed the finish line in first place, Joe didn't see dollar signs or breeding potential. He saw the same scraggly horse he'd saved with his last $40, a creature that had given everything when shown a little kindness. Later, as reporters crowded around asking about Fortune's future racing plans and the lucrative breeding offers pouring in, Joe kept his answer simple. "We're taking it one day at a time. Some things you do for money, but the best things you do because they're right." The headlines the next day called it the greatest underdog story in racing history. How a poor farmer's $40 horse had not only won millions but had brought down a corrupt empire and restored faith in the sport itself. But for Joe, the true victory was much simpler. Standing in his barn that evening, sharing an apple with Fortune, surrounded by family, and knowing that sometimes the richest rewards come from the choices money can't buy.